So, my questions were going to be, hang on a second, I'm going to go back to them. Date you're born.
Where
were you born?
Isn't that ridiculous? I don't know. I don't think it was Manly Hospital. But see, Jenny would know. Jenny was my sister.
Yeah.
Jenny was 13 when I was born. She was really embarrassed that Mum was pregnant at 38 in 1957.
Yeah.
So that was a big issue for her. And she remembers a lot of that whole me being born, I suppose. What else was I going to say? So it was local. I'm pretty sure it was local, whereas my kids were born at Paddington, so for the doctor.
Mm-hmm. What year were you born?
1957. So next one up was Stuart. He was 11 years older. He was 11 years old when I was born. Jenny was 13 years old and Chris was 15 years old. Right. So our history, it's like I have a different family history to them, because by the time I was 6, Jenny and John were married out of the house. Stuart was with Diane, 16, 17 years old, around there. They soon moved out of the house, and Chris. So by the time I was about 10, I suppose, a bit younger, I was like an only child. But Mum and Dad's fortunes changed because Dad started his own business in decimal currency day. What day was that? The 12th of February 1966. That's the day he opened B.A. Veitch and Company. And so I enjoyed their wealth, I suppose you could say. Yeah. So they were in Condamine Street, where they were in from when they were married, 1942. And Mum's father had built the house. He was a master builder. Yeah. And that was our family home. And then in 73, we moved out of that, and he bought that block of land in Fisher Street, so over the hill into a probably a better area of Balgowlah Heights, and built his mansion, or their mansion, their design. So up until then, Mum, when they were young, before I was born, Mum was an A-grade tennis player. She was statuesque, great set of legs, great mum. They weren't well off. Dad worked for a company, metal manufacturing company, but they went camping, family holidays like that, camping. Condamine Street, where they lived early days, was a dirt road. Just a different life to what I had.
Yeah.
By the time I came along, and a few years later, they became well off, but Mum had started drinking. Dad was always a heavy drinker, and so Mum started drinking. So my childhood, I had sometimes arguments, I suppose, but because I've always had it, it wasn't anything that dramatic, I suppose. I just, as a little kid, you just work around it. So some mornings I walked myself to school, but everyone did anyway in those days.
What's your earliest memory, do you think?
Of me or of Mum?
Just something back then. What's one of the earliest memories?
Oh God.
Something you can recall that because for me, I can remember my 5th birthday and getting a particular thing. Is there anything you can kind of...
Do you really want to know?
Yeah.
It's silly.
Ah.
I remember being in the cot.
Yeah.
So how old would I have been? About 2. Mum coming into the room and saying, "My God, what have you done?" And what I'd done was a nappy, which was a cloth nappy in those days. I'd done a poo, and I got the poo, and on the wallpaper, which was like Sanderson roses in my bedroom, I painted with the poo on the wall. So that was my first memory.
Yeah, that's great. That is great.
Beyond that,
do you remember any particular birthday parties? As well, being an only child, in a sense.
Well, I think I did. I remember going to others, but birthday parties weren't a big thing. Like now they're a bloody event. It's just hundreds of people, and you've got to have the right balloons, the right colour coordination, and everyone's got to have the right clothes and invite the whole bloody class.
Yeah.
It didn't happen every year for my birthday or my friends.
Yeah.
So I do remember Mum used to make a lot of my clothes. So, for instance, I remember going to a friend's birthday. It was primary school. So maybe I was about, 12. and Mum made me a dress that was hot orange, and I had a hat on that she bought, and it had a feather in the hat. Why would you wear these things to a party? And I wanted a pair of patent leather shoes that were at DJ's, and they were luminous orange, the most beautiful shoe, a full shoe with socks.
Yeah.
So Mum used to dress us all. She always made clothes. So, and being an artist herself, she, dressed us beautifully all the time, I think. Other young memories, I remember Stuart when Diane used to come and visit. So, and I remember Jenny and John's, my sister Jenny and John's wedding. So I was 6. Jenny Wise was the bridesmaid, I was the flower girl. Mum had made the outfits. I was in love with one of Jenny's friends, Peter Scriven. He was the best man, I think, John's best man. I thought he was just beautiful. I mean, I was only young, but I was attracted to he was a handsome-looking guy.
Yeah.
I remember standing at the church when, I don't know, they were probably during the wedding ceremony, and turning around. Because I was young, I didn't realise, but I was looking at the whole congregation, and I remember a few people were weeping, like I think Betty and Pat. Well, Betty was a bit teary, and I remember thinking, why are they crying? That's sort of a memory.
Yeah.
But obviously, it was a big celebration. There's lots of people. I don't remember the reception. I don't even know where it was. I have no idea of any of that detail.
What about with school? Where did you start at school? What school was it?
Balgala Heights Primary. So from where we lived in 18 Condamine Street, it was 10-minute walk uphill to the school. Like I said, it's very common for everyone to just walk to school. I didn't walk with Mum. It's just, you'd see some other kids ahead of you walking to school. So I was there all through primary school. Then Mum wanted me to go to Winona, which is where Jenny went to high school. And I just put my foot down, and this is me being a bit more sport brat, I suppose you could say, and said I didn't want to go to that school, I want to go to McKellar, which is where all my girlfriends went, the public girls' school, McKellar Girls. So that's where I ended up going until 4th form or year 10. And then Hales Business College. Mum said, okay, if you're not going to go to year 12, because I wasn't academic, I just wanted to earn some money. I did well at school generally, but I just wasn't interested in going on. So she said, well, you have to go to a private secretarial college, at least give me that. So I used to go into Hales in the city, and we had June Daly Watkins used to come in and give us lessons.
Where's Hales? Where was it?
When you come off the expressway, so you're going to the Rocks, and it's the second left turn. Is it Grosvenor Street or somewhere there? It was an really old building, and you used... Yeah. And you used to have to get dressed up properly, like as though you were going into a job. I remember having a hand-me-down at Jenny Wise's. It was tie silk suit. It was a beautiful turquoise suit. You really got dressed up for your classes to go there, just to learn shorthand, typing, and June Daly Watkins telling you how to cross your legs, don't smoke in public, how to behave around boys. But she was she did it very well. She was very humorous, and how to be a lady, basically. But I didn't finish there because I got caught up with going out, and I didn't study my shorthand, and so I didn't actually graduate. And then Mum made me go to Williamstown at Manly, another business college, and I graduated. And then I went and worked for my brother Chris. So yeah, a few other jobs. So yeah, that's my school, my education. That's it.
So was the family quite close? Were you growing up with the siblings coming back to home a fair bit, or were they kind of living their own lives? Or?
Yeah, I mean, look, Jenny and John were down initially. Again, they would confirm, this is just my memory. When Ange was born, Jenny was 19? So she was young. And they lived with Nana Wise, Mum's mother, who was Scottish and very regimented in her everyday routine, and Mum thought Jenny would learn more from her, how to manage her everyday life or whatever. I think she went there initially, but at some point when the kids, Scott and Ange, were definitely, Scott was born too, they lived in a back room at Condamine Street. So that was, and so they had the kids in it was just one big room. So they did that for a couple of years. And then Nana's maybe, and then they got their house at Goondari. They won that block of land, you know, and the thing that, and built their house. But I found with the family, yes, they were getting on with their lives. Like Chris was married, Stuart and Diane were about to be married, I suppose. They would take me for the weekends because sometimes Mum was, you know, she had bouts with her alcoholism where she'd have a bad run for a week or so and then she'd be fine for 2 weeks. And so they would just, I don't know how they gauged the situation, whether they would visit, but I would go and stay with them for a weekend. So it gave me a bit of a break. But at the time I didn't see it as them giving me a bit of a break. I just saw, I'm just going to their place. You know, like Ange and Scott were close to my age. So when I was 10, Ange was 4 years old. When I was 12, she was 6, whereas Jenny was 13 years older. So she was more like a mother to me. And I used to go to Chris and Leslie's place, I suppose. One time they lived over at Waitara, or it was near a graveyard. I remember Chris taking me through the graveyard with Leslie and scaring me, because that's what Chris did. He was he's a bit of a nuisance that way. Stuart and Diane, I remember going to visit Diane's parents' place in Centennial. Well, it's across the road from the Sydney Cricket Ground. So there's a main road there. And I think it was a semi. It wasn't a big house. And I've been there. I went there a few times. They had a kangaroo in the backyard. I used to love that kangaroo. It's about this big. It's just funny sort of things you remember from their house. Their household was so different to mine. So, you know, everything was organised and set, and the dinner and washing up, and there was a routine. Their lounge room was tiny. But I was happy to go there, and I'd hang out because I adored Diane. I used to look at her and think, oh, isn't she beautiful? She had this classic profile. And when she talked, her chin moved a particular way, and I loved watching it. It's stupid. So she would come over to Mum and Dad's place before they were married, and she would be caused to go in the bedroom with me because there was 2 bedrooms, 2 beds, I mean. And I'd wait. I must woken up at sunrise, and I'd wait for her to wake up and wait and wait. As soon as her eyes had opened, I'd go, and she must have rolled her eyes. I now find out, yes, I was a nuisance because she wanted to, they would have had a big night the night before or something. So I saw all the family at all those different things. There was always birthday dinners, and Mum was always a good cook and had family gatherings, I suppose.
It was quite common. Like, you guys would get together quite often. I
think, you know, I really don't think at the capacity we do now with Stuart with his family, me with mine, Jenny with all you guys. You know, whenever there's a birthday, we all get together with everyone and their kids. Don't know if that happened. Jenny and I'm talking sort of until we moved into Fisher Street, my memories are all sort of, I don't know. When I was 16, we left that house. No, I was due in year just before I was 16. So up until then, when I was 14, went to a girlfriend of mine said, come up to the local church, which was St James Church at Dobberoyd, on your way to Dobberoyd Point. It's now a kindergarten. And it was an offshoot of All Saints Church at Bagala. And we had what do you call a trainee minister? Not a catechist. He was a trainee minister, so to speak, a young guy. And so we had coffee shops up there, and it was only a small church. Everyone was sort of my age. Like I said, I was only 14, and I knew a couple of the girls. They were a year above me at school. And we had a fine old time. There would be about, 30 of us. It was a proper church service, and then we'd have a coffee shop later. And that's where my memories are probably the clearest, is from there on, of having that social scene. We used to have guys on bikes roar up, and we'd be in our hot pants and go, hi, do you believe in God? And all the, like our thing was to convert them, but it was all sort of a bit tongue-in-cheek, I think. So we had a wide range of people we met at that church, and then the minister from All Saints looked from afar and thought, well, they're having too much fun. This isn't very good. we're going to shut down this church. Because we were having a lot of fun in these coffee shops. We had music. Don't know if we had live music at that place. But yeah, it was really a local, all the kids, all of us, all teenagers used to come and turn up. Maybe 50, 60 people.
Wow.
So he shut it down, and I don't think it functioned. I think it functioned as a church morning services for a bit longer, and then they shut it down. So then naturally we migrated to All Saints. So through all this, my mum was saying, and she often spoke more candidly when she'd had a few drinks, and she'd say, what's all this God business? I don't agree with it. Well, not that she didn't agree, but she saw it as limiting to my perspective on life, especially sex before marriage or romance and things like that. She said, that's why wouldn't you want to love and enjoy things? You're young and beautiful. This is how she used to talk when she was drunk. She wouldn't say it so much when she was sober. But anyway, I continued to go. I had lots of, we used to go to the surf at North Stain with the people from that church. So school holidays especially, we would hang out at North Stain in the sun. I used to, before I go down to the beach, I used to put a concoction of cooking oil and, what was it? Cooking oil and vinegar, shake it up, paint myself and lay in the backyard, have a bit of a sizzle for about an hour, put lemon juice in my hair. This is to get the look, the surfer chick look. And, I've got freckly skin, but, it'd burn and then eventually go brown. So I was about 14, and we'd go down, we'd hang at the beach. So there was particular seats, from Queenscliff, there's seats about every 30 metres. So there was a particular seat that we'd all hang at, and Keith would be at the other seat, and they were with the older guys that were a bit more, what would you say, world-wise than all of us. And it wasn't just the church people that we were hanging with, it was other people who were our age group. We just used to hang there, the guys that surf, we'd just sort of sit and talk and check each other out, go for a swim. And then we'd catch a bus home, which was the 132 from Manly Wharf, which would take us, most of us were from Bagala Heights, and they'd all get off, a lot of the guys would get off and come to my place. And so Mum, you can imagine, there were sheer curtains. So there was a front veranda, which back in the day was Stuart's bedroom, and then it was Chris's. They'd moved out. So it was like a sunroom, and we had an LP, what do you call it? Not an LP, a record player. And so I think my first album I got was, Mum and Dad used to play Tijuana Brass. And I, Fiddler on the Roof, all of that. Then when I was about 14, I wanted to get a record. What was it? We did this on Facebook recently during COVID. Everyone put in their best albums. Was it Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young? No, Uriah Heep, Look at Yourself. That was my first album. So everyone would get off the bus, come and hang. We'd all be smoking, but I supposedly wasn't smoking, but all the guys would be smoking. No, not really any girls would get off the bus. And Mum used to stand in the lounge room and observe, keeping an eye on me and what was going on, but I think happy to have kids around and see who I was hanging out with. But when she was drinking, she used to be a bit more cheeky, and she'd come and sit down with everyone. And they'd know that she was drunk, but everyone was nice to her because she would provoke conversation. And she'd look at people and say, well, what do you do? Where do you live? And she'd sit down, and she used to say things like, Escabibble, I shall worry, no, not I. All these, she's like a grand dame. And so they loved Mum. They loved Mum and Dad. They loved that we had a cigarette machine that Dad used to make. It was about that big, and it'd have B&H in there. And you put 2 20-cent pieces in and pull out the drawer, and there's a... So I used to just give it out. This is beautiful. And then when no one had money, even Mum and Dad used to use the knife and get the cigarettes out. They ended up having to take the machine away because there was no money. But so those years were where my universe was centred. So family coming and going, I was just so into my friends and doing all of that stuff.
So
I didn't really.
No boyfriends? No boyfriends?
Yeah,
no serious
yeah.
boyfriends?
Yeah, I think my first my first boyfriend was Peter Brown. Now Peter Brown, who I still see as a good friend now, he lived up the road. So he had luba lips, he had Negro lips, but he had blue eyes and blonde hair, fuzzy hair. He was an athletic, nice guy. He was a very keen churchgoer and very popular guy. But Dad didn't like him because he worked in the bank after he left school. And Dad, the classic thing Dad said was, that bank clerk type. Who's he? Why are you going out with him? It was a reasonably innocent relationship. You know, we didn't have sex or anything like that, but it was all kiss and cuddly and, you know, let's pray and Bible studies and all that sort of stuff. Then my next boyfriend was Mark Butler. Went out with him for 6 months. He was a local guy too. He's a lovely guy. And then Greg Burness, I think, was my next boyfriend who I married. So, yeah, I had relationships, that's for sure. Just trying to think, what else happened? Yeah, so then we progressed from that church to All Saints when we were about 16, 17. At All Saints, strangely, a lot of the older guys who were sort of up to 5 years older than us were all going into uni. So it was in the early 1970s, so there was still that attitude from the 1960s, the Vietnam War. The hippie scene was really full on. Being aware of the world around you, being radicals, so not really radicals in terms of today, but in those days, young people all of a sudden had a voice. They've never ever had a voice in history. So, you know, Dad used to think, you know, what are these types? Who do they think they are? And they've got long hair and, you know, I don't think much of them. But he was always happy to have my friends in the home, so was Mum. So we were mixing with people that are a little bit older, a bit more world-wise, I suppose. And the coffee shops were a very well-known form of things to do. So there was wine bars and there was coffee shops that were usually attached to churches. But our one, at All Saints, we somehow met these guys who were from the inner city, and they were like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, beautiful voices, and they sang a lot of that music of the time. And we'd get 200 people plus come to the coffee shop after the church service. Again, we would all be dressed to the nines because it was church, but we were very aware of our fashion, I suppose. A bit more serious about our Christianity. We would have Bible studies, we would have discussions, group discussions at those Bible studies. We had a few things where we went away for a weekend and it was like a mini Woodstock, I suppose you could say. So music was a big part of this church-going friends. And yeah, we used to Keith used to come. So there was guys like Keith who was so not into the church scene. But everyone knew that's where you meet up with people, that's where friends would go, and they'd listen to good music. And if we approached them and sit down and start chatting, we talked about God or whatever, they'd snigger and, you know, we'd snigger, and that's all it was about. So a lot of people remember All Saints that I know now who grew up in the area, because everything was so local. I suppose it always is. You were local, weren't you, with all your friends?
Yeah, grew up in Avalon.
Yeah, and so, did you grow up in Avalon? Yeah, so that was sort of a big part of my life, and also my rescue for Mum, who was I was more aware of her alcoholism, so I was finding it difficult, so I wasn't very secure, and so Christianity gave me some base, I suppose, some friendship, people I could talk to, and Mum continued to sort of feel what's it all about. So when I had Bible studies downstairs at Fisher Street, so we went from Connemon Street to Fisher Street in 73, we moved into Fisher Street. Beautiful home, it had a big rumpus room downstairs, a swimming pool. So the kids, you know, all my friends used to come and hang out there. It was a good place. By then people were more couples, so I had more of a group of a dozen friends that I'd see every weekend. And I'd have a Bible study during the week. Not necessarily, you know, say, I don't know, 10 people. Again, Mum would come down when she'd have a few drinks. She'd come down and she'd sit and she'd say, "So, do any of you have sex?" And we all go, "Oh," you know, and I'd be sneering in the corner going, "Shut up, Mum, shut up," you know, and they'd all talk to Mum, and Mum would, they would just be humorous with her because she was being provocative. And she'd say, "I think it's all very unnatural that you do this, and I don't understand all this God business. I think it's stupid. You should be all out there having fun and enjoying each other and travelling the world, and, you know, what are you all doing sitting talking about Bible?" And, you know, so she was very provocative. But through all of this, Mum and Dad were very well known by all my friends. As a testament to that, when they at both their funerals, a lot of my friends were there, like Stuart's friends and Jenny's friends. So they were always very popular, even though we had a colourful upbringing, I suppose you could say. It wasn't conventional, but I always felt loved. I never felt resentful. It was just not having, I suppose I didn't feel I had benchmarks from Mum, because sometimes she was drunk. And when she wasn't, when she was sober, she was she was a very inspiring person. She was statuesque. She was someone you listened to. Same with Dad. I always felt that he always had our back, the whole family, not just me, but he was always a patriarch, is that the right word? And there was family members, uncles and aunties. Our place was always, even like with me, with Mum and Dad and family, there was often family get-togethers at Mum and Dad's place. Yeah.
Hold there for a minute.
So you said another section. Have you got in mind?
Yeah, so I thought we'd chat about early 20s or something, you know, just go into a bit of
Okay,
more
so
responsibility kind of.
yeah.
So, you know.
So early 20s. So I was married to Greg when I was 23, 1980. So the relationship, I suppose, was a couple of years old before we got married.
Where was it?
Where did we get?
Married?
All Saints Church. So we were all still going to church. There's a few people sort of moved on. That coffee shop scene sort of had a natural sort of death, so to speak. There were other people who were able to go to the pub and, you know, do other things for entertainment. So there wasn't such a draw card towards the church as much for people who weren't involved in the church itself. But we all still went to church. So there was Greg, Johnny Walker, Peter Brown, who was, you know, my old boyfriend. So we're all still all good friends, Jen and Chris Bell. A few people started to move away from the church and question the whole scene anyway. Sort of we did, but anyway, we still kept going to church. A couple of friends that had children. So yeah, we were moving into that sort of side of life. I went overseas when I was 18, so that was sort of 6-week trip, and that was a bit of an eye-opener away from. So I regress. So before we were 20s, when I was finished business college, I went and worked with Brother Chris. Didn't particularly like it. Then I was asked to work for a place called Middle Earth, which was set up in Fairlight. It was set up by this group of the older people in our church, older than me. So they were in their mid-20s. They'd all finished uni. They were all starting to be teachers or lawyers or whatever, or they were just about to. And they created this shop, which was a shop front for people to come in, and it would introduce people to Christianity, I suppose. It was used as a means to reach out to the wider community. And 1970s, indoor plants, macrame hangings, and I was the girl behind the counter. So they offered me the job. But it was all reliant on people's donations. The church wasn't really backing it, but they were aware of it. And Mum and Dad didn't like me working there because I was only getting paid the equivalent of the dole. And they said, well, that's just a rip-off. They're just using you. And we don't think you should be there. You should be going and looking towards something else for your life. So I was there for about a year, and lots happened. I got involved, and there's a lot of gossip, a lot of fun, people falling pregnant before marriage, helping someone, the guy that lived upstairs, his name is Greg Smith. He was helping out a girlfriend of mine's older sister who got caught up in heroin. She was caught up in the city and all that scene. So it was a real eye-opener to the wider community.
So this would have been what
1978, 77, 78. I hadn't been going out with Greg at this point. I was still kind of hanging out with Pete Brown, but he met Lou, and so they just became simple social friends. And then that shut down. Eventually it just died a natural death. It became too, imploded because people got too involved in each other's lives in a Christian way. They were using, we used to go upstairs and have meetings every month and look at the outreach program, what can we do? But their lives moved on, so did ours. We just basically grew out of it, I suppose you could say. Some people stopped being Christian, they didn't like the whole scene altogether. And so church just became going to church every Sunday. Met Greg. He was a local guy, but he went to Knox Grammar. So all the people we knew went to local schools. Private school wasn't such a big thing then. His parents made him go to Knox Grammar, so he had short hair. He had to have short hair. And so he was kind of a little bit on the outer, but he got to know everyone after he finished school, when he was 17, I suppose.
Can we just go a bit back to you travelling?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so what year was that? 1976. So how it all came... Yeah. So how it came about was with the family business, Dad's family business. So Dad and Mum were the directors, and they did metal manufacturing. Incinerators for girls' toilets was one classic thing that was like a franchise of a bigger company called Goodrid, and the factory was at Brookvale. But then the guy next door, the factory next door, I'm digressing, but it just explains why I was travelling overseas. With the guy next door had a factory who made standard lamps, so the lamps with the lights off them and things like that. And he offered the business to Mum and Dad, or maybe Mum saw an opportunity, and if the lamps were made out of metal, so they had the machinery to do it and the skills, I suppose, engineering-wise. And Mum designed a whole range of lamps. And John Barry was the salesman. Mum was the designer. Dad made the money happen and how to get it all out there. And Stuart was in the factory getting all the workers to do the job. And it was called Majestic Lighting, and really even the boxes were fantastic that Mum designed, and those lights that are at Angie's place, those round ones, that was a classic design, and they were in that hot orange, so 1970s, so it did really well. Business just took off from the time he opened in 66 to now it's sort of early 70s, and so they were looking to overseas for designs. So John and Jenny went over, but more importantly, when it affected me, Stuart was going to go over to the World Fairs. So there's one in Hanover, one in England somewhere, I can't remember where. And so we were seeing Stuart off at the airport because it was a big deal, people going overseas, and everyone, see you later. And there was a bit of a group discussion with Stuart, John and Dad, sort of over there at the airport, and what they were talking Dad into is saying, why don't we send Deb over to meet Stuart and just write her off as a tax deduction as a business trip. And also they'd been putting, $1 into an account since I was born. I forget what those accounts are called when a kid's born, and that it was sort of, they used that to finance it. So 10 days later, after the smallpox injection and all of that, the guy actually met us at the airport with the passport. So 10 days, it was really down the line to get me over there. So here I'm on the flight, I think, what do you call the Qantas flights that have just stopped? The planes have just been decommissioned.
747.
747s, you know, with the big nose. So there I was, sitting on this flight and
All on your own.
all on my own. It was,
How was that?
a bit scary, I suppose.
Where were you flying to?
To Milan to meet Stuart. So he had already arrived. That's right, one of the first one we went to, the first World Fair was in Milan. So got off at Milan and just was astounded by the beauty of all these people in the airport. They were beautiful, honey skin, honey eyes, honey hair, and beautifully dressed, beautifully. And I was just fascinated. Stuart was lost, trying to get to pick me up at the airport. So I had about an hour and a half to kill sitting around waiting for him. Anyway, so I was just gobsmacked at all these beautiful people. And then he finally arrived in his hire car and off we went, and there were these big roundabouts, you know, they were huge, and Europe had them way before we did in Australia. But they were huge roundabouts, and I remember just going round and round and round because we couldn't see or read the exit sign because it's all in Italian, and just laughing. Stuart would have been, if I was 18, he was 29, I suppose. So Diane was at home. They already had, I think they had, was Jussie born, maybe Adam? So he was away. It was a 6-week trip, and I think Stuart was away 6 weeks. So I was with him in Milan. We went to the World Fair. It's huge. It was an industrial fair. So you had things from huge, big trucks, like mining trucks, to jewellery, you know, and everything in between. So Stuart was there to scout out new designs for the lights. I don't even know if he had a camera to even take photos of things. He might have, but he probably had brochures, and he was going to bring back those ideas. I remember after a few days in Milan of this World Fair, and it was a lot of walking. I said to Stuart, you know, I'll just sit here, you go off to that place over there, you know, part of the World Fair. It's like the Royal Leicester show on steroids. It was huge, huge thing. And I remember sitting there, so I would have had jeans on. I was freckly, I suppose, 18 years old, having a ciggy, as you do. And there was a family walked by, and again, a lot of the people were just beautifully dressed. That was classic for Milan. And there was this family, mum, dad, couple of kids. The kids were running by, and I was just sort of watching them running by. And then they stopped in their tracks and looked at me and then said, Mama, look. And I thought, what is it? What is it? And then every time we caught the train into the fair, this is over 3 or 4 days, people would be, you know, we're all standing, they're all going to work. We were going to the World Fair, so it was a commuter train. Yeah. And they were beautifully dressing it. And they'd all just blatantly look at us and check us out. We could never work out what it was. Was it our freckles? Was it we were dressed casually? It was quite strange. We were very much not Italian, I suppose, by our colouring. Stuart and I, blue-eyed and freckly skin, bushy hair. I don't know, but anyway. So we went to a restaurant. We got ourselves lost. We did, you know, we had to pull over. We had a few drinks, and we had to try and find our way back to our hotel. It was only 5 minutes away, but it was Italy. We just couldn't. And we pulled over, and Stuart got out and asked this woman, and it turned out she was a prostitute. So she was hanging on the street corner and looked at Stuart. And he said, well, actually, I just want directions to get back to this hotel. You know, it's just funny. It was nice spending time with Stuart.
So no romances over there for meeting?
Oh, God, no. We're only there for about a week. Then we headed towards Hanover. And at some point, it might have been as we were going to Hanover, we contacted Jenny Wise, my cousin, who had been living in England for a couple of years. She had a pretty serious relationship. She lived in Putney in England near Knightsbridge, and she flew over and met us, and then we had the road trip going through Switzerland and a few places. I can't remember where we went, but it was probably a week travelling with Jenny. One day we got lost in the car. Jenny was looking out the car and she said, Stuart, are we supposed to be going north or south? And he said, well, north. And she said, well, the sun's on this side. We're going in the wrong direction. And we went, and it was getting late. It was starting to get dark. So we followed this road to the end, and it was literally a Swiss village that came out of a picture book. It was the mountains snow-capped. It was beautiful. we stayed at this hotel, there was vacancy, and we had this lovely night having fondue, so that's where fondues are created. So little dishes, tasting dishes and meat that you cook. It was just fantastic. They had a bit to drink, I had a bit to drink, went upstairs, wasn't well, and they continued the evening. So we had a lot of laughs with Jenny. We went to Cologne. I remember sitting having, I suppose it was a coffee, because that was another thing, people would sit around and have coffee. We didn't do that in Australia at that point. So I remember sitting in this big square in Cologne. We'd seen a church and it was a huge piazza. And from the corner we could see these white horses and a carriage about to canter across this piazza, and it was obviously a bride and her betrothed in the carriage, and they'd just been married at the church and they were sort of going through the piazza. And we're going, wow, look at this. It was like, Snow White or something, these white horses. And as this is the sort of silly things we giggled about. As she was getting closer, we're going, look at that. And she turned and smiled at us, and she was really ugly. She had this big nose and funny teeth, and we just all went, oh, just silly things you remember. Yeah. Silly things you remember. So then Stuart contacted Diane's brother, Alan, and his new wife, Sue. So for their honeymoon, they'd only just gotten married back in Australia. For their honeymoon, they were travelling for 9 months overseas, and they were going to get a combi van, and they were going to travel England and then Europe in the combi van for 9 months. Which is something that people were starting to do a lot more of, and Australians were known for that, especially going to England. So Stuart organised for me, he was heading to the next World Fair after being with Jenny, how did he do this? I went back to England with Jenny. I stayed with her in Putney for 3 weeks. I met her boyfriend. He was like a James Bond to look at. Great guy. He worked in the North Sea oil fields and would come down to London on the weekend, maybe every second weekend. Very, very handsome man and a real charmer. He had a Jensen Healey sports car, and we'd jump in the sports car when he'd arrive on the weekend. We'd go for drives and just laugh, and he was the funniest guy. They didn't, the relationship sort of, for various reasons, didn't last, and she ended up coming back to Australia a few years later. But at the time it was great staying in Putney. Sort of had to entertain myself during the day because she went to work, she was a secretary. So I bumped into a friend at an art gallery from Australia, John Edwards. That was sort of just a coincidence. We went to a local pub in Australia House, what was it called? Earl's Court, where all the Aussies went. Yeah. So I did a couple of things as far as being in London, went to Portobello markets, did touristy sort of things. While I was there at Jenny's place, and obviously I had a phone call about every week with Mum and Dad, Mum said this one time, she said, stay there. And I said, what do you mean stay here? And she said, well, you're qualified. You can live with Jenny. I'm sure she wouldn't mind because she was in a really nice 2-bedroom unit. I'm sure you get a job and stay there and enjoy it. And this is where I'd say is one of my, not a regret, but I wish I'd tried the other side in saying, okay, because it would have been a different life initially. Being in London in the 70s was a pretty happening place. It would have been fun to be there. And I know also Mum and Dad were probably thinking to get me away from that, what they saw as a cloistered group at church and religion and all of that, to get me to break out in my life. But my response to that, her saying that, was, but I'll miss all my friends. No, thanks very much. And so my friends were so much more part of my stability, I suppose, that I didn't see beyond that, and I wish I had have, because it would have been a great opportunity. But anyway, life goes on. And then Stuart organised for me from Jenny's place in Putney to meet up with Sue and Alan. Alan is Diane's brother, because they had the combi. They were about to do a tour of Scotland. Did I want to join them? It was their honeymoon. I said, oh, okay, how naive am I? But I thought, well, each night there's a lot of B&Bs. There used to be through this. I realised there was a lot of B&Bs, and I would just stay in those. Oh no, they said no, we're right. And so in the back of a 1960s combi, you know, it's about this wide. The three of us are in the bed. I'm sort of right up at the edge, and they were 5 years older than me. So recently, so in my memory, I thought I'd travel with them for 2 weeks, and we had a lot of laughs, and we went to castles and did this and that. Recently, they were caused to go through their old photographs, and she found her diary from that trip, and so she sent me some photos from that trip, and also quoted what was written in the diaries. So I know it was 1976, about May, and it was only a week, so we're only together for a week. Things that we ate, and we went to a pub. We went to, I remember when we were in Edinburgh, there was a significant finals in the soccer game, and there was streets with people yelling and screaming, and that was a lot of fun. We had a lot of laughs, we got drunk, all in a week. That's why it seemed like it was 2-3 weeks. So that was, and then from there, I think I came home. I was with them for a week. I must have travelled with Stuart around Loch Ness, round there, and then came home and got a job, had to get a job when I got home, got a job at Commonwealth Bank in the city, CSB Sydney.
How was it coming back? Were you happy to get home? Or
Yeah. It was nice coming home. And Mum and Dad were glad that I wasn't working at Middle Earth, so that sort of caused a natural break from being in that scene. So I worked in the bank, didn't mind it too much, was a bit bored because I was in the banking chamber. I worked there for a couple of years, meeting people who weren't from the Northern Beaches, so meeting girls that lived in southwest Sydney and going to their places, driving my little Mini Minor. So when I was 18, I regress, Mum and Dad gave me a brand new Mini Leyland Mini sports car, hot orange, and it was a surprise, so I didn't know. So
who taught you to drive?
Well, Mum laughed too much. She, you know, and you gear car and, and she just laughed. She couldn't talk. So then her brother Jack, he was a lot more patient. He took me around, and then I'd had an instructor the last few times. So I got my licence.
So none of the siblings?
No. So I was one of the first people who had a brand new car in my group. You know, so Mum and Dad were very, you know, generous and spoilt me with getting a brand new Mini. So I was very lucky. Why did I mention the Mini? What were we talking about? You have to remind. Oh, coming back, yeah. So I used to shoot across, going to North Rocks in the Mini, or you know, so I was sort of breaking away from, I suppose, the scene of the church a little bit. Then I met Greg, so we all hung out, and yeah, got married in, as I said, 1980, age 23. Had Mitch and Lauren. Mitch when I was 27 in 1984, and then Lauren in 1987 when I was 30.
How was it having first one?
Having first bub? Good. Friends had already had babies, so we're sort of, you know, it was fine. I was living, I should say that while Greg and I were going out, and then when we were married, we stayed in a house that Jen and Chris Bell had rented. They went off overseas for a year, and Greg and I had just gotten married, so we moved into their rental property, which was a little house across from Office Works at Brookvale, and it was a little shack, literally on probably an acre of land, and you look straight across to the coast. You could see the water, and it was like a 1920s shack. It's a fantastic spot. So we were there for 9 months while Jen and Chris travelled around overseas. When they came back, we then all moved in together at Gulf Avenue, Manly, in a little house down there, which had a common wall with what is now Harris Farm Markets. So we lived there for about a year or more. Greg and I split up in that time. He'd sort of met someone, and so we had a bit of a split up, and I moved back home, and that sort of lasted, 4 weeks or something. Then we got back together. Then Jen and Chris moved out. We all sort of went our separate ways. Chris started working in the banking industry himself, like Bill. And so had an opportunity to get a housing loan at low rates. So they went and bought a house at North Balgowlah, and Greg and I moved into Mum and Dad's place at Fisher Street downstairs to save money, just like Lauren and Troy. But we didn't save any money at all. I fell pregnant. So we had Mitch. We lived there until Mitch was just before he was 1 year old. So it was nice for Mum and Dad to have us there and have them around. So that was a big support for me. It was really nice to be in a nice home and have Mitch there with us. And
was Mum and Dad hands on with it?
Oh, pretty much, yeah. I'd see them every day, and we didn't really, a lot of the time, and it was even before all of us had kids, our entertainment was visiting at each other's houses. There wasn't sort of venues that we would go to, or we weren't sort of going to the pubs or anything. So I would have people, we would go to each other's places for dinner, and so as far as babysitting, we didn't need it because everyone just came with their kids. That was sort of the way we entertained ourselves. So often people would come to our place because it was a good venue. It had a swimming pool. Kids would be in the pool. So it was nice in that way. But, 2 weeks after Mitch was born, so the 2nd of March, I think, 1984, eldest brother Chris was killed in a car accident. So that,
How did you hear about that? How did you hear about that?
A phone call.
Where you were?
Yeah, so a phone call at about 2 a.m. in the morning from Fran, who was Keith's partner at the time. Or actually, they'd split up a few months before because he'd met another girl and was having an affair, and Fran moved out with Kirk and Courtney. But Fran rang us and said Chris has been in a car accident. This is in Victoria. He's in a coma, and so because I'd only just had Mitch, he was only 2 weeks old, obviously they said, you're not coming with us, but Jenny and John, Stuart, Mum and Dad, all shot down to Melbourne, so they had arrived there in the morning. And I think they stayed, you'd have to ask Jenny and John maybe, but it was a case of, will he survive? And the doctor's advice was no. In the car accident, he was in his Porsche with his girlfriend, just a local, to go to the shop, I think. And he took a corner too quickly and spun out and hit a telegraph pole. The girl died instantly, but Chris didn't have a seatbelt on, and his head got a lot of the impact from the pole. So his brain was mangled, so there was no chance of survival. So it was more a case of the doctors saying, this is what my interpretation was because I wasn't there, but the doctors saying to Mum and Dad, you need to make a decision to turn the machines off, talk about it, think about it. And then, ironically, in the middle of the night, Chris died. I don't know whether it was naturally from the terrible trauma or whether they just let him pass without telling the family. So I remember Mum arriving back into the house, and I had Mitch, and he was, as I said, 2 weeks old, beautiful little bub, and she just held on to him. So she needed to resuscitate herself with new life because she'd lost her son. So it's very sad. It was probably more sad, less for me because Chris was 15 years older, so even though he's my brother, Jenny and Stuart, Jenny especially and John were closer to Chris, so they socialised with him, they grew up with him. And I did too, but he was much older. So, you know, that was a real pulling together of the family. You know, lots of friends of Chris's. He was very, very popular. So he had lots of friends that gathered for the funeral and came to see Mum and Dad. And it was very traumatic for Mum. And we were there. So that was March. We'd moved out. So the following year, I think it was January, we moved out. So we were around. So we were a good distraction, I suppose you could say, for Mum, having Mitch around. And he was, you know, a lovely little bub and very responsive, a very much a crowd pleaser. So, yeah. So it was nice. It was a nice healing time, I suppose you could say. The other thing that happened, and the reason partly also to move in with Mum and Dad, you know, the year prior was Mum had glaucoma in her eye. It's a condition of pressure behind the eye, which if it's not treated, which is a release of the fluid pressure, if it's not treated then you could go blind. And Mum had a surgery which should have just been a day overnight procedure. Well, during the surgery she got a golden staph infection. So within 24 hours, the golden staph had literally eaten her eyeball down to just a little bloody pulp. And they rushed her over to St Vincent's. She was at Manly Waters Hospital when this happened. Because of golden staph, it's obviously any hospital to have that, they've got to shut down and stuff. So they whisked her over to St Vincent's to an isolation ward. And so because of that happening, Dad said, could we move in, you know, to there to help Mum, because she was obviously unwell. And that had happened. So... so this was sort of 6 months prior, a year maybe prior to Chris passing away in 1984. So that was a big trauma for Mum to go through.
Did you ever see your Mum and Dad change in any way after Chris's passing? Was there a difference? Did she drink more?
No. When she lost the sight, so I'll say what happened to Mum. She went over to St Vincent, she lost the sight of her eye. So that was a big thing for Mum. So her drinking actually became less of an issue. And so did their relationship change? I think maybe Mum became more outspoken. She became, I don't know. I think she was... you know, when your children are older, you know, so they're not dependents with you anymore. They're starting to establish their own lives, which obviously Chris and Jenny and all of them were established. I'd gotten married. I had now had a child. So our relationships with Mum and Dad became more grown up. So they saw maybe a bit more of us then. So, a few more family gatherings, I suppose. Mum wasn't so bad, but she did still have times, but not like they were previously. It had only lasted a couple of days of, you know, bad drinking bout. Their relationship with each other, I don't know. You know, I've got memories, but it was well before Chris dying. I've got memories of putting Mum into rehab with Dad, because she was just a slobbering mess and desperate and wanting help. And, you know, I remember taking her myself one time, going over with Dad another time. But that was sort of 5 years before. So to see Mum not drinking as much was a relief for everyone, I think. Relationships and family gatherings weren't as weird. But as a consequence of Chris dying, as I said, his relationship with Fran had already broken up. Mum was desperate to make sure that the children were okay, because Leslie was still in Melbourne with the 4 boys. And she said, you know, they had a house in Cromer while they lived in Melbourne. It had been rented out. So naturally, Leslie came back to Sydney to then go and move back into the house that they had. And they lived with us. Mum and Dad had a holiday house down in Dalgety in the snow, near the Snowy Mountains scheme. So Mum and Dad happily said, we'll go down to Dalgety, you bring the kids here at Fisher Street, and just to gather them, Leslie, to, you know, wait for the renters to move out of their house at Cromer, which ended up being an absolute disaster. They'd trashed the house. So there's a few issues she had to deal with. But it meant that there was a roof over their head while they got themselves sorted out. Hang on, I've got all this wrong. This happened. No, that all happened years before when Leslie and Chris split up. Yeah, no. So Mum was estranged from Leslie, Mum and Dad, and the rest of the family. She was angry because of Chris meeting Fran. That's right, it was Fran that she'd met. So that was early 70s. And I've regressed back 10 years. Come back to when Chris had died, then it was a matter of Fran being safe and taken care of with the kids, and Chris having this huge insurance policy on his life that no one was aware of, and a significant amount of money to be dispersed among his dependents. And that didn't go down too well. It wasn't dispersed fairly, probably, I would say, and it estranged the kids even more from our family. They were young teenagers by then, living in Queensland. And a few court hearings with the executor of the estate, which was Fran, sorted out the muddle. Mum and Dad weren't really in a position to tell Fran what to do because she was legally the executor. So that was very fractured after Chris died, and that was a very sad time for Mum to see the breakaway of 4 of her grandchildren that she hadn't seen. So that was, really difficult because we were all really traumatised that there was that terrible break and ugliness that went on.
Let's change tack. Let's talk a bit about your kids.
Okay.
I want to talk a bit about Mitch and Lauren.
Yeah, so Mitch, Greg and I were very happy. Mitch being born, Greg was a proud dad. His parents were involved as much as my parents. After Fisher Street, we moved. Mum and Dad said, okay, we're moving out of Fisher Street because Mum couldn't manage the stairs there, and we're going to build a house at Eleanor Heights, so you have to move out. And I think it was probably they thought we were going to continue to live there because we hadn't. So they said, here's some money. They gave me 25 grand and said, go and find a house. And so we lived with our friends Jen and Chris Bell. By then had moved into a substantial home in Addison Road, Manly. And Mitch had his first birthday there, and he had his first steps there. They had a huge lounge room. We had, for the first birthday, there was Kelly, Justine, Yvette. They were all young teenagers, I think. And Mitch with his big blue eyes and a real crowd pleaser. So we found our house, which was Manlyvale, 23 Innes Road, Manlyvale, which was an old deco house in appalling condition.
I did like that.
Yeah, it was a nice house. It was called Jesmond, Jesmond. That sign is still there in the house. 2-bedroom, double brick, 600 square metres, perfect first family home. But as I said, it was really run down. It had horsehair plastered roof that had strands of paint that had broken down and horsehair. It had an old gas heater at the foot of the bath. You know, there's one belching sort of thing that you turned the tap and flicked a match and it went boom, and the heater inside would light up so all the pipes, and you know, there's your child, a little baby sitting in the bath, but anyway, you put up with it. And probably a year later, we renovated the house. So we put in a new kitchen, polished the floors, did some painting, put on a deck on the back.
What year is this?
Well, Lauren hadn't been born, so it was probably we moved in 1985, May, I think 1985. So it was probably 86. Lauren was born in 87. Yeah, so that we had the next door neighbours, the Mountfords, a couple of other kids up the other end of the street. So very much a great neighbourhood, and lots of kids running up and down the street into each other's houses when they were a bit older. Excuse me. Greg was, in his career, was working for Channel 9. So, excuse me, he was floor manager at the Mike Walsh show. Remember that midday show? Which was a significant impact on Australian television, having guest speakers, having comedy, variety show. I think it went for an hour and a half. So his career was starting to be in a form of where he was enjoying it. He was very good at his job. Being a floor manager, he had to keep the crowd happy. He'd indicate when to clap. He'd also let the people like Mike Walsh know when the cameras were going to start. So he really did well at that job. Then it became Ray Martin's show. Ray Martin was a lovely man for him to work for. And I remember Ray Martin and his wife giving, when Lauren was born, this beautiful dress and sending me a lovely card, which I was pretty chuffed with. And his career, it's going pretty well, I think. And then, he had problems, we had problems with each other. So neither of us were happy, but you sort of continue on. And then the marriage broke down. So he left in October 88. So Lauren was 14 months old. Mitch was 88. He was 4.5, I suppose, which was a bit of a shock for both of us, not just for me, but for both of us. He moved out and moved in with a girl that he'd met. And I sort of had to get my shit together, basically, and get a job. And he gave child support and did all the things that he should have. It wasn't an angry and destructive split up. It was just, we've just got to put our head down and ass up and sort this. He saw the kids, but was caught up with work often on a weekend and couldn't see the kids. So there was all that stuff going down. But as far as the home was concerned and where I was at Innes Road, I was really happy and the kids were happy. You know, I suppose because you have a relationship that's really struggling for a couple of years, when it finished it was kind of a relief. And again, my house became headquarters for all the local kids. And there was lots of happy memories. I think the kids were pretty happy. I tried not to badmouth Greg in front of them because I'd seen my sister-in-law Leslie, Chris's wife, badmouth Chris in front of her kids when they stayed at our house when their marriage. And I saw how destructive it was and always thought I will never ever do that because the kids were drawn into an adult world that can be pretty ugly for young children, and I just didn't want them to see that, even though I had anxious times with Greg trying for him to be involved in seeing the kids more than what he did. Joy and Harry were very much, when we first split up, I know that they were frightened that they wouldn't see the kids again because my kids were their only grandchildren. Their daughter unfortunately couldn't have children, Leslie. But that wasn't the case. They were very much a great support, as much as my parents, when I went out to work, they'd have the kids one day and have dinner ready and I'd come home. Mum and Dad did the same. So so they were very much still part of the kids' lives. So that was nice. That's and nice. Life went on. Yeah. Greg was there when he was there.
What did you do for work?
I got a job. It was like a sort of like what you would say is an online outlet nowadays. It was ABC, so you could get videos of shows on the ABC, you could get books.
Yeah.
And so it was a big warehouse, and I was on the computer system. People would send in their requests of what they wanted, and we'd put it in the computer and it'd be dispatched. So I got some computer skills because computers weren't part of our careers before that.
No.
Joy Burness had a friend who worked in HR who suggested I do a course to learn, it was called Word Perfect, and I think that's what it's called. So you type and it'd come up on a screen. So this is all new technology. So I did that course, and it enabled me to then move on to get a job with a doctor, I think it was. I'm just trying to think. Dr. Brian Holt, who was an orthopaedic surgeon down at Manly. So I worked there a couple of days a week and earned some money. Cleaned Mum's house. By then they'd moved to Eleanor Heights, so cleaned her house once a fortnight or something, earned some extra money. And met people, including Larry, that I met through Scott Barry and Larry and all that scene of, because were you around then?
95 when I came on the scene.
95, you were?
When I came on the scene.
Yeah, so this is early 90s, so...
No, I don't know, I've never heard of Larry.
Well... So a lot of my friends obviously were at a similar stage in life where they had children, but I was one of the few that were divorced. So when Greg did take the kids for the weekend, I was just sitting around by myself, and I wanted to meet people, and I wasn't meeting them through our friends. They were all steady and sitting at home. So Scott Barry was playing social rugby, just a local comp, and his mates Wayne, Steph, and guys he went to school with. So I was in my early 30s, Scotty would have been late 20s. He said, come along to the game, just as something to do, because after the game they got together at Narrabeen Surf Club and they'd have a few drinks and have a few laughs. So I came along to the game, and I kind of knew his mates. Like I said, they were only sort of 6 years younger than me. And they'd been travelling overseas, and a guy they met over in Canada, a Canadian guy called Larry, came and lived with them. And so Larry was there, I met Larry. So Larry was a Canadian, he was a Negro, and he was a bit of a lad. But I enjoyed he was very funny, he was very sociable, and they all liked him, and so there's a lot of laughs, and so I started going out with Larry. But the big conundrum was that my father was very racist, and Dad was very angry that I was going out with Larry, and his words were, I will have no daughter of mine going out with a bloke that belongs in the bloody trees like an ape. That's how racist my father was. So I said, basically, well, up yours, Dad. I'm still going to go out with him. And so Dad and I didn't talk a lot in those few months, maybe 6-8 months. So I was going out with Larry for about 14 months. He was a rogue. He ended up, he was, stole some money from I didn't know any of this was going on, but he was a party boy, so there was a lot of drinking, there's a lot of parties that I went to when the kids were with their dad. It opened up a whole new world to me, because my life as a single girl before I got married was very much orientated around the church and all of that scene. I knew about that other stuff going down, but it didn't interest me, and I didn't do that. So this sort of opened up a whole new world for me, and understanding what blokes were about and what stuff was going on out there in the scene of romance and sexuality and drugs, as in the form of marijuana or dope, nothing more than that. So I was sort of having a taste of those sort of things, and having a lot of fun. Had a lot of fun with all those people. They were a great bunch, and it just, it was the right time for me to sort of find confidence in myself again, and just have a lot of laughs, I suppose. The kids really liked Larry, Lauren especially.
Yeah.
because he was a bit of a, you know, he wasn't a great Negro in the sense that he had one eye that was a bit off centre. He couldn't dance. He was a little bit overweight, just a bit, and he couldn't sing. So, you know, he wasn't the perfect Negro in that sense. But as I said, I enjoyed my time with him and all of the other people. I really just enjoyed that social scene. But then it all fell apart when Larry was caught with his hand in the till. He worked for Manly Pacific in the bottle shop, and he'd been doing it for quite a while. And he was caught on camera, and it all fell apart from there. He was charged, he was put into Villawood because they found he'd overstayed his visa by about 2 years. He'd got his hands on a Medicare card. I think he must have stolen a wallet. So he had a Medicare card of John's Citizens, so he'd had medical. So he accessed to all these sort of services very under the radar. He was, as I said, he was a, what would you say, he operated at that level while he was here. So Dad hadn't actually met him. So before that had all hit the fan, this one particular weekend, we had a family gathering. Fran came up with Kirk and Courtney, and it was at Scott and Veronica's first home that they bought in Newport on Prince Alfred Parade, I think. And it was a lunch, and they'd asked us along. It might have been because Fran was up from Melbourne with the kids, and so there was Mum and Dad, Jenny and John, Stuart and Diane maybe, and me and Larry. Now Mum knew Larry was coming, but she didn't tell Dad on purpose, because in her mind she thought enough is enough. I want to meet this bloke, and so let's see what happens. So Dad didn't know I was already there with Larry. He knew that, we all knew that Dad was coming, and Larry's a bit nervous, but you know, he thought, okay, here we go. And Dad walked in, he stepped up, hello, Mr. Veach, and Dad basically shook his hand very limply and just walked away into another room. And we thought, well, and Larry thought, okay, I'm not going to fuss about it. And so he chatted, and then it came to lunch. So we had a table, Scott and Veronica had, you know, beautiful meal set up, and there's two tables. There's the tables for the grown-ups, and then a table over there for the kids. So that was Mitch, Lauren, you know, Annalise, I don't think Yvette or Ange were there, so it's more the younger kids. And we all know that Dad loved his grandchildren, but he certainly wasn't, you know, a hands-on grandfather in that sense. But he would not sit at the table where Larry was sitting. So he said, bugger you, I'm sitting over there. Sat down at this little table with all the kids. And the kids are going, oh God, because they used to call him Bruce. You know, Bruce is sitting at the table. And we would so our conversation was continuing, Dad refusing to be part of that table where Larry was sitting, sat with the kids, and he was really gruff and cranky. You know, watch out, you know, you're dropping that, use your fork and knife. So we all were observing and all got the giggles. So I think I nearly wet my pants. We were all laughing so much at Dad being so adamant not to sit with that table and just observing how he was with his grandchildren. It was very, very funny. It was very funny. So it lightened the whole situation, which was an absurd situation. His racism was just, I think, through fear. A lot of his generation have a fear of dark-skinned black people. So you know, that Larry never actually came to spend another family occasion. It was soon after that he was found out. And as he walked out of the steps of Manly Court, being charged with robbery, I suppose, cash out of the till, the Department of Immigration, who couldn't get him while he was in the court, waited until he was physically walking out of the steps, and one on each side, and said, you're nicked, and put him into a car, and he was driven off to Villawood. So we were having dinner.
There?
No, knew the court was happening. I was at work, I think, and obviously heard about it. So we were at a restaurant, the Indian restaurant up the road here at Freshie, waiting for Larry to turn up. And we were told, one of the mates said, this is what's happened, he's in Villawood. So we all sort of gathered at my place, I think, or a couple, and there had to be some money. You could get someone out of Villawood to have a chance, because from Villawood they were basically put on a plane, for him it would have been Canada, and deported. But there was a turnaround of a week or something, and you could actually pay legitimately money to get them out of there, to enable them to get back to their house, to pack their clothes, do all that stuff. Well, we did a whip around with Scott's friends, all his peer group, and I don't know how much money it was. Maybe it was $1,000. I put some money towards it too. And within 48 hours, Larry was back out. And he'd enabled him to, excuse me, I can't even remember seeing him in that time, but it enabled him to get all his clothes together, and we were able to go to the airport and say goodbye.
Yes.
And that was that. So that was the end of that sort of thing. You know, strange things happen, like Greg and I went through our divorce formally, and because it was before child support came in, when you were divorced, at the time you go into court and your solicitor gives the judge who's sitting in front of you the agreement of money to be paid from the husband to the wife for the child support that was agreed via our solicitors beforehand. It also talked about the breakup of the property. And so I was going out with Larry then. So Larry babysat the kids while Greg and I drove into the city, went through the court, or the divorce, so to speak. Then both of us drove back. And then Larry was in the car while we had Mitch, Lauren, Greg driving, Larry, me, and Greg dropping us all back at Larry's place. They had a group house, pretty crazy times in that house in Carrington Parade. So there was some weird times in that, you know, Greg and I had just gone through this emotional thing of being divorced, and there was Larry sitting in the car making chat with Lauren, and Greg would have just been thinking, you know, who's this guy? And so we had a bit of communication, Larry and I obviously realised
No more contact with Lauren.
a little bit, but he was a rogue, and I was just blinded by the social enjoyment I was having, not just with Larry, but just because we didn't have any real depth in our relationship. It was just a fun time, I suppose. So I don't know whatever happened to him. I think all those guys, I think they all lost contact with him too. So don't know what happened. They all got on with it. I continued to socialise with them for about a year or so after. Yeah. And then
talk about Keith.
Then I met Keith.
Then you met Keith.
So
Before we start, we're going to have a quick. Okay, so Keithy.
Yeah. So.
Where did you meet?
Well, he was a guy that was someone I already knew because he lived in the local neighbourhood, Bagala Heights, from when he emigrated from England in 63, then 66. So he was, vaguely remember him at primary school, definitely down the beach. So he was one of a bunch of locals who, you know, as I said, in the early 70s, we all hung down at North Stain. And then John Walker, my friend, his marriage split up, and he remarried a girl called Belinda, and Belinda and Keith were good mates, and they'd known each other quite well for prior 5 years. So I was caused to go to a couple of things where Keith was there, and one of them being his 40th birthday, which was at the Irish pub in the Rocks. Is it called the Mercantile?
Mercantile.
And that's where he had his 40th birthday. So it was with his family.
Good Guinness there.
Hey?
Good Guinness there.
Yeah. So it was friends and family. They'd sort of hired out a big area. And I'd said to Mum, because I'd met him a couple of times, Mum was always very astute. She'd always pick up on things with all of us. And she said, "Who is this Keith bloke?" And I said, "Well, it's someone that I've met, and he's got a son. He's sort of a fireman and You know, he seems like a nice bloke. And Mum said, well, for heaven's sakes, let him know that you like him. I said, what do you mean, let him know? What are you talking about? She knew this party was coming up. And she said, well, you're always friends with so many boys, as I had from when I was a young teenager. She said, but you need to let them know that you do like them in particular. Because I never went on dates, really. People just sort of got to know me and then I'd start going out. I was never a girl that a guy would ask out on a date because I was always just friends with them. So I took her advice on board for this 40th birthday party and bought what was it called? The birthday cards, the funny birthday cards, far out birthday cards.
Oh, yeah, from Gary Larson?
Yes. Yeah. And found a funny one and thought, okay, when we arrive, I'm going to personally walk up to him and give him the birthday card and, you know, pointedly make a connection with him, so to speak, but I didn't know how or what. So we arrived, his family is a big family. He's one of 5 kids, and so there was a substantial group inside, then all the friends I knew were outside. So I thought, no, I will walk in. He happened to be standing with his family. And I walked in between his family and I said, hi, Keith, happy birthday. And looked at him. I just gave him a look, so to speak. I thought, is this what Mum means? I'll give it a go. So he said, thanks, Deb. And very quickly, Doug, his dad, walked up to me and he said, hello, because Doug always had an eye for the girls. Yeah. And he said, hello, who's this? And Keith said, Dad, this is Deb. So I shook Doug's hand. And Doug said, oh, cold hands. And I said, warm heart. And he said, smelly feet. And that was our banter. And Keith sort of looked at that banter and thought, she's interesting. She's different from, you know, whatever. And so the night went on. Nothing actually happened. He was... had met up with some other girls beforehand and they had a hotel room, so I wasn't involved in that, but that was sort of like a Monday or a Saturday. By the Thursday he'd rung me up for a date and we got on really well. We went to a restaurant in DY and it was seafood, and I remember sitting down at the restaurant and we were talking. Keith's a chatterer, as we all know. And I kept noticing as we were talking, his hands were sort of busy, and I said, what are you doing? And he said, and he sort of went a bit red, and he said, oh, I'm peeling my prawns. And I said, but how are you? And he was trying to peel his prawns with a knife and fork because he didn't want to seem uncouth using his hands. So, you know, we got on pretty well straight away. Timmy was... so it was 1994. His birthday was 2nd of June, so it was a week later. We were on this date. And very quickly we fell for each other. By about the 6-week mark, we'd sort of, Keith on his days off, I'd go out to where he was living at Narrabeen. He bought one of the permanent homes in Narrabeen camping ground. And so he was the main carer for Tim, so he was with him lots. So my kids would meet Tim and we went out various places, and he was, as I said, a fireman, so Lauren thought he was the ant's pants. Mitch liked him, but he was a bit more just watching, checking him out a bit.
Well,
Tim was...
the house, right?
Yeah. And Tim was, you know, he used to call Keith. You know, and the kids would laugh. You know, he was a funny little kid, really cute. And then we just spent the morning together, went to our separate ways to pick up kids from school. So I went to pick up Lauren from Manly Vale. He went to pick up Tim from Harbord Public School. And then I had to take Lauren to gymnastic classes at Allambie. And Keith was heading back up the hill, up Allambie Hill. We crossed paths in the cars. And we went, oh, and I said, well, I'm going there. So he pulled in. The kids went and ran around the oval. And then Keith dropped a bombshell. He said to me, we were both sitting in the front seat, I was in the driver's seat. And he said, will you marry me one day? And I just went, apparently I just went, and just hit my head. I just went, this is 6 weeks into the relationship. I was shocked. I didn't know what to say, what to think. I just said, maybe, I don't know. It's just all a bit out there. That day, not that day, probably a couple of days later, as usual, I was, Mum and Dad would have the kids on their day during the week, and Mum said, so how's it going with Keith? And I said, okay. And she said, so has he asked you to marry him? And I just looked at her and I said, no. And she said, oh, I think it's a bit more interesting than what you're saying. So Mum was so intuitive in things like that. So we continued the relationship. Our friends, his friends became my friends, mine, his. We fitted in well together. We went out for about 2 years. That's right, we had a camping holiday, which was an eye-opener for both of us too, because I had decided before I met Keith, a few months before, that I wanted to take the kids camping. I never did that in my childhood, whereas Jenny and Stuart and Chris did with Mum and Dad. So I decided to get a tent, and friends of mine, John and Belinda and Sue and Greg Marinan, we decided to go to Scott's Head. Parents from the kids' school at Manly Vale said Scott's Head's a great spot to camp. So I got the tent, we got it all sorted. I met Keith. One of the people that I was going up with, John Walker, said to Keith, are you coming too? And I looked at John and said, I hardly know him, going away for 10 days in a tent. He said, yeah, that'd be good, mate. So within 3 months, there we were heading up to Scott's Head. We had a camping holiday, and from there on that continued every spring for 10 years. But in that time, nothing sort of came of us getting married or us getting engaged. In 1995, Mum died. She was ill and had lung cancer and was gradually getting worse and worse, and she passed away in September 95. So I suppose because of that, I'd said to Keith, soon after, I said, are we going to do anything? Is our relationship going to progress? 2 years had gone by, and we weren't living together or anything at that point, but seeing a lot of each other. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, life's too short, what are we going to do? And so we decided to announce our engagement. I just wish we'd done all this when Mum was still alive. She would have loved to have met Keith's mum. They would have gotten on so well. And they were similar colouring. They were both redheads and lovely people, matriarchs of their family. Anyway, so we had the engagement party at Mum and Dad's place at Eleonora, with Keith's family meeting my family, and that was November 95. Then we moved in together a few months later into Manly Vale, and with plans to be married in February of 1997. We got married and had a great wedding. And life continued. I inherited money from Mum and Dad's, as Jenny and Stuart did. So that enabled us to move from a 2-bedroom house at Manly Vale that I'd been there for 13 years. I was ready to move on. Keith wasn't. He finally had a home and he felt stable and happy. He didn't really want to move. But I saw the opportunity of investing and getting a bigger home. And 9 months later, we found this house, or I found this one. We moved in here, and it's been a wonderful home for us. So we moved in here in 1998, and very much a blended family, and all the complications and the fun and everything else of normal families, and then of blended family issues, which are different slant on things. And yeah, so we just
travelled a lot,
Hey?
You've travelled around a lot.
Yeah, so in 1990, because I had some money from the estate, we were able to, Adam Veach met Lisa in Austria. He and Just were skiing and living over there for about a year. He met Lisa, he wanted to marry her, and so we all went over to Austria with the kids for the wedding, and then over to England and met Keith's cousins and auntie that he was very close to. and had a bit of a holiday then, which was good fun. And then in 2005, so Mitch was already in uni, Lauren was working, Tim was working at Woolworths. Mitch hadn't moved out. Lauren was about to go overseas, and we decided to rent out the house for holiday rentals because we realised that there was great money to be made. There wasn't the online platform of Airbnb, it was more emails and stays. So there wasn't even the internet, there was just emails. Had the computer for Mitch, so we put an ad on stays and bing, 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 we got all these responses from overseas via the stays platform of people wanting to rent out the house. So we moved out of the house and we were both still working, and as I said, the kids I'm just trying to remember. So Lauren was about to go overseas, and Mitch moved into a flat with Lauren. That's right, she came back from overseas. I can't remember now. Mitch was over in Canada. He did Work USA, so he was in Canada. Lauren stayed with her dad. Tim stayed with his mum. We went to Narrabeen and commuted from Narrabeen, me to Mona Vale, Keith to Manly Fire Station. And people came into this house. For 2 weeks we had rentals, and we went to Tassie and we made a lot of money. We thought, well, this isn't bad. But we did it, that's right, we did it via an agency, not via stays initially. He couldn't get any more things, so the next year we decided we'd do it ourselves through stays, and we had 4 months living in the van at Narrabeen. And so we did that for about 3 seasons and made some good money. By then the kids were well and truly out of home and established. And then in 2011 we decided to go around Australia. My career with my job, you've got long service leave, 10 years. It was 9 years, and I was doing a part-time course at TAFE, a fine arts course. But my job was turning a bit sour and I didn't want to be there anymore, and we decided we'd go around Australia, which we did for 11 months in the camper van. Rented out this house to the Tressiders, and off we went, came back. Then John Walker and Sue were doing up their house, so the Tressiders moved out, but that was a drama. They wouldn't move out initially, and we ended up having to get the sheriff to come in and move them out because we said they could stay longer, and we said no, and he wanted to sue us, and he sent a letter to our solicitor to sue us. It was all drama. Anyway, it all worked out. We got them out of here, and we did a lot of house sitting, then finally came back into this house. So we're 2020, so 2014 I think, and realised that upstairs we quite like this outlook. And why don't we do upstairs? And Lauren and Troy had been together since 2010, and they were renting, and the exorbitant rents. Mitch and Nell had bought their house at Camperdown, so Mitch and Nell had lived at Nell's mum's place for, 14 months, 18 months, saved a ton of money and ended up buying a place. Tim was established at his mum's, and he'd actually bought a house too, a unit at Narrabeen. But he was just renting it out, I think, at the time, and living in his mum's. So we said to Lauren and Troy, do you want to move in downstairs to save money and get yourself into the real estate market? Which they did, and very soon, sort of a year or two from there, Mitch and Nell had Alexa in December 2016, the 2nd of December.
First grandchild?
First grandchild.
How was that?
Oh, exciting, very exciting. I remember zooming over because Nell had Alexa at Prince of Wales Private Hospital, and Nell was, we all adored Nell, we were very pleased with their relationship, and same with Lauren and Troy. Tim had a couple of girlfriends, no one serious at that point. And so she sort of asked me to come along for the first scanning of looking at the baby, and also her mum came along. So that was lovely that she sort of brought us in on that moment. And yeah, Alexa being born, it was so exciting, and she was obviously beautiful, and we adored her. But they lived at Camperdown. Nell was looking at maybe going back to work, so I said, well, you know, I want to be involved in that, because I'd obviously retired back in 2010 before we went around Australia, so I had the time. So I was going to go and visit and get Alexa used to me. Mitch was working from home. He was working for a company called 3D Systems, and it was a working from home setup. And then, so that was early in 2017. And then Lauren said she was pregnant. So that was exciting. Zan was born in April 2017, 5th of April. And I was sort of visiting their place to get used to the routine for Alexa so that Nell could go to work. We had a big Mother's Day bash there, and I think I sort of felt the gathering of the families, which was really nice at their place. And it was newly renovated. And then I went over, as I said, to babysit Alexa again one day, and Mitch sat me down and said, Mum, I've been offered a job in Singapore. And I was so excited. I mean, I was shocked, but I was just so elated that he had a step in a big way for his career, and he's really excited by it. He was a bit shocked that I was so excited. I think he wanted me to burst into tears and go, no, 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 my son, do not go. But I wasn't never going to be reacting like that. I was so pleased for them both, and I knew that they would have discussed it at length and worked out that this is what they really wanted to do, and that it was obviously a good offer. It was worth it money-wise. Nell's dad, Brad, who lived in Hong Kong when they were little kids, they did it in an expat sort of lifestyle. He rang me and reassured me and said Singapore is a wonderful place, it's safe, it's clean, it'll be a wonderful opportunity for him, which it was. But they had to get married. So they were engaged. Mitch had proposed to Nell 18 months prior, I think. And then this had happened, I think it was around about June, for the ease of him going over to work as an expat under Hewlett Packard. It was easier paperwork-wise for them to be married. So he said, Mum, we're getting married. And we said, when? He said, well, next week. And he said, where? At the registry office, he said, at Broadway. Oh. I said, well, okay, we'll be there. Well, you don't have to come, Mum. It's just getting married, you know, it's just to do the bit of paper. No! I said, no way. So we arrived with a bouquet for Nell that I bought the afternoon before. I said, you've got to have a bouquet. Greg came, Nell's brother came. By then, Nell's father was actually living in China at the time, so he wasn't able to be there. Lauren, me, Tim, Keith, and Greg Burness. And we all arrived, and we're all excited, and they're all sort of going, well, cool it, guys. Mitch said, I'm just going to go to work afterwards. We're going, but they were kind of excited. Alexa was there. I'm just trying to think, Zan was there, I think, with us. I don't know if Troy was there. Tim was there. Yeah, so we walked into this room and we all went dum dum da dum 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 da dum, because Mitch and Nell were trying to downplay it, and there's no way we were going to let them downplay it. And so we all got in there. Leslie was there, that's right. Mitch's auntie, or Greg's sister, was there. And so they went through with the ceremony, and then we all gathered across the road at UTS where they actually met each other. And we had a cup of coffee, and I went to work and Mitch went to work and Nell went home, and that was that. So a month later, Emma went over to Singapore, and a few months after that, Nell left and they rented out their house. So it was lovely to have Lauren here with Zan, because we could put all our attention onto Zan. He was an absolute delight from day one, like they always are. So we've been now, it's 5 years. Zan's comes up now because he's a bit more grown up. He says, Papa. Nana Papa is he adores Papa, and he adores Troy's mum, Grandma, and he loves me, but I'm a bit tough on him sometimes, so he doesn't necessarily just turns away. He doesn't want to know Nana sometimes because I'll say, don't do that. Whereas Papa can't say no, just like he was with Tim. He can never say no. So, yeah, we're now enjoying all of that, but because of COVID, we haven't seen Mitch and Nell. We happily had them, all of us together after the Marinissans thing, end of last year. We had Christmas together at Scott's Head, so that was lovely. I had the diagnosis of cancer in February 2019, surgery, chemo, and believing I might have had a few from ovarian cancer, that I might get away with a few years of being cancer-free. But unfortunately, it was great that we all gathered together and had that time together. In January, I was diagnosed with stage 4. And life goes on. So I'm here today, enjoying every day, but it's really tough with COVID. I haven't seen Mitch and Nell, and they really miss the family, and obviously, but we have FaceTime, and maybe they'll get an opportunity to come over. I think they're working towards it. Mitch is anyway. So I'm getting treatments and I'm feeling okay, and that's the way it is. And so Keith and I are heading off just had radiotherapy, so that's gone through that, and hopefully it's killed the buggers that are a few of them, and now I'm starting a second trial next month, but we're going on a camper van trip around New South Wales in a week. So we're hopping in the camper van again, so it's been 10 years. Or we've had quite a few trips in between, and trips to America. That was a wonderful 6-week trip we did in America in 2013. And we've been to Italy with Mitch and Nell last October. Again, I think it was propelled because of my diagnosis. They organised it. They said, we've got the tickets. We're covering your airfare, and we want you to come with us for a 3-week trip to Italy. So Nell, in all her wonderful ways, did the whole itinerary, and it was an absolute wonderful trip to Rome, Puglia region, and then Praiano, and had a wonderful time with them and the kids. And I was quite well then, so that was lovely, enjoying time with them. And just the beautiful venues that Nell picked out was just a wonderful trip. So, life goes on.
Yeah.
And here I am now with you, the dag of dags, taking a film of me, talking about my life.
Which is very interesting, I have to say.
Yeah. Most people's lives are amusing, I've learned through life, that nothing is as it seems. You can't judge a book just by its cover. There's always something in people's lives that you've got to appreciate and just be, like I said, my diagnosis, I'm frightened of what my future has, but I'm certainly trying everything I can to these drug trials to maybe they can just maintain me, because nowadays cancer, it's stage 4 is not necessarily a cure, but you can live with cancer, and that's what I want to hope I can do. So, so that's it.
That's it.
That's me for today.